First of all, I'd like to wish you all the very best for the new year. May 2026 bring you plenty of good things. We're kicking off the very first day of the new year with a new episode from the series, Is It Really That Bad? A series in which we set out to explore that very question and hopefully answer it when it comes to albums that were poorly received by both critics and audiences alike. The previous episode on U2's Pop absolutely blew up in terms of views, so I'm very curious to see how you'll respond to this one. Because this time, we found a very famous candidate, Columbia Records' most successful recording artist, Mr. Bob Dylan. Roll the title sequence, and let's get started. Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of We're Only in It for the Music, a YouTube series that takes you through the musical universe, from ABBA to Zappa and everything in between and beyond. Click the like and subscribe buttons, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an episode. But enough of that, never mind the bollocks. We're only in it for the music. Bob Dylan released countless classic albums no music lover can afford to ignore, albums that have permanently reshaped the musical landscape. It was therefore more than justified that Dylan became the only musician ever to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. That said, I personally think that this prize should have been awarded posthumously to the late Leonard Cohen. The Canadian bard was far more of a poet than a songwriter, making him an exceptionally fitting candidate for such an honor. But today, we're talking about Dylan, and unfortunately, poetic brilliance is not exactly what comes to mind when we turn to his 1990 album Under the Red Sky. When it comes to poorly received Bob Dylan albums, there's no shortage of options. Some of those may very well be discussed in future episodes, but this time, the focus falls on Dylan's very first album of the 1990s. Why I chose this particular record, out of all those questionable releases, is something I'll explain later on. Okay, enough with the introduction. Let's get into it. Bob Dylan may not have exploded out of the starting gates with his self-titled debut, but as I already reviewed in part 1 of 10 essential 1960s debut albums, that says far more about its follow-up, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan from 1963, than about the debut itself. You could reasonably argue that from his 1962 debut all the way through Nashville Skyline in 1969, Dylan released nothing but strong albums. 9 outstanding records in a row is a monumental achievement for any artist. Feel free to try and top that. But in Dylan's case, it merely marks the opening phase of a long career that is, remarkably, still ongoing. During this stretch, Dylan evolves from folk singer, and very much against his own will, reluctant spokesman and protest icon, into an electric folk rocker, before suddenly swerving off the road altogether and releasing 2 entirely unexpected albums on which he reveals a crystal-clear country tenor voice. Hold on. So Bob Dylan could sing like he does on Lay Lady Lay and All Along the Watchtower in the late 60s, yet apparently chose, quite deliberately, to sound on the albums before that and again throughout much of the 70s like a nasal vacuum cleaner suffering from a chronic head cold? Which brings us to the eternal debate. Is Bob Dylan a good singer? I'm not going to open that particular can of worms just yet. It deserves an episode of its own. But let's put it this way. Dylan is not a technically great singer. However, when it comes to delivering his often brilliant, biting, and cryptic lyrics, he operates in a league of his own. His voice has character, and with character comes division. Some listeners simply cannot tolerate that nasal twang. I don't mind it, as long as the song material is strong enough and the voice actually sharpens the song rather than dulling it. Queen Jane, approximately from the magnificent Highway 61 Revisited, is a perfect example of a track that gains power precisely because of that nasal delivery.
Won't you come see me, Queen Jane?
Bob didn't really start consciously slacking in terms of quality until the Half-Baked Covers album that was Self-Portrait in 1970. At that point, he was actively trying to sabotage the near-messianic worship surrounding him, and he did so by deliberately releasing a deeply mediocre double album. In other words, Dylan knowingly put out a terrible record, which makes it all the more baffling that another self-portrait, later released as part of the celebrated bootleg series, turns out to be a genuinely enjoyable listening experience. After all, it draws from the very same period and recording sessions. Apparently, his conscience must have started itching at some point, because shortly thereafter Dylan pulled himself together and went on to release yet another run of solid albums. The 1970s, after all, gave us genuine classics such as Blood on the Tracks and Desire. By the late 70s, however, Jewish-born Robert Allen Zimmerman converted to Christianity and embarked on a run of intensely religious albums. The transition started out promising enough, with Mark Knopfler on guitar and behind the production desk. But once the 1980s arrived, the constant praise of the Lord combined with an increasingly clinical and now painfully dated 1980s production sound began to take a serious toll on his popularity with the general public. On top of that, Dylan refused to play the evergreen hits audiences actually came for. Instead, he bombarded concert halls exclusively with religious material. Set lists from these tours were almost entirely devoid of hits, and audience reactions were sharply divided. To be fair, the live performances from this era, beautifully documented on Bootleg Series Volume 13, Trouble No More, capture a fiercely committed, gospel-driven ensemble that is hard to fault on a musical level. Unfortunately, that same sense of urgency and conviction is largely absent from the studio albums of the period. Dylan would only truly claw his way out of this slump toward the end of the 1980s with the release of one of his masterpieces. Or actually, one of his many masterpieces, Oh Mercy, released in 1989. U2 frontman Bono introduced Dylan to Canadian producer Daniel Lanois, with whom U2 had already crafted several hugely successful albums. What followed was nothing short of a creative resurrection. Bob Dylan, reborn not as a Christian, but as a songwriter. Both critics and audiences responded enthusiastically. And after years of waiting, devoted fans were finally rewarded. Gone were the songs about the Lord. Gone too was the sterile, over-polished production that had plagued much of Dylan's output throughout the decade. In its place came Daniel Lanois' warm, hazy, swampy sound, a production style that wrapped Dylan's songs in atmosphere rather than smothering them. For most listeners, Oh Mercy felt like a genuine return to form. It restored faith in the future. Dylan proved that at 48, he could stage the kind of comeback everyone had hoped for. But few still believed it was possible. In 1989, being in your late 40s or early 50s effectively made you a veteran, long before pop culture learned to revere aging artists the way it does today. Back then, you were expected to quietly fade into the background, and then came 1990, and with it, Under the Red Sky. While Dylan was largely occupied with supergroup The Traveling Wilburys, time was nevertheless found to record a new solo album. This time with the rather unusual help of a long list of famous guest musicians. I vividly remember browsing for Bob Dylan albums and coming across Under the Red Sky sitting in the bargain bin. That should have been a first red flag, but what did I know? I was young and ignorant and in need of new Dylan music to feed my new obsession or addiction. At the very least, the cover looked better than most of his 80s output, Oh Mercy being the obvious exception. The hype sticker certainly did its job. It proudly announced, with special appearances by David Crosby, George Harrison, Bruce Hornsby, Elton John, Al Cooper / Jimmy and Stevie Ray Vaughan, Don Was, and more. The song titles on the back didn't ring any bells for me at all, but between the cover art, that hype sticker, and the fact that this was the follow-up to Oh Mercy, I decided to throw it into my Dylan shopping spree. Add to cart. On paper, this looked like it had to be an interesting album. And that, precisely, is why I chose Under the Red Sky for this episode. The album was recorded between January and May of 1990 in various studios. Where Dylan had been celebrated in the mid-60s for revolutionizing pop lyricism and had taken a very explicit Christian turn in the late 70s, we were now presented with yet another, previously unheard, other side of Bob Dylan. Most of the lyrics on Red Sky, as I will shorten it for convenience, sounded like children's songs, nursery rhymes, or moralistic fables delivered with almost disarming simplicity. So, on paper, Red Sky should have been a Dylan album backed by the absolute crème de la crème of popular music. In practice, however, things turned out slightly differently. Let's dig into the track list and find out what Red Sky actually has to offer musically. The album opens on an immediately dubious start with the particularly weak, or rather, outright terrible, opener, Wiggle Wiggle. To be fair, musically there isn't that much to complain about at first glance. Don Wai's production is a bit on the slick side and some 35 years later sounds unmistakably dated, but at least the band is playing well enough and the song moves along in a fairly enjoyable up-tempo shuffle. Star guitarist Slash of Guns N' Roses fame handles lead guitar duties on this track. However, anyone expecting a blistering Slash solo reminiscent of his late 80s heyday is in for a rude awakening. What we actually get are a few limp guitar licks before the song quietly expires. Dylan had originally intended for Slash to perform a Django Reinhardt-influenced solo on Wiggle Wiggle. However, upon hearing the rough mix, Slash discovered that only his acoustic rhythm guitar part had survived. Dylan felt the solo sounded too much like Guns N' Roses. Slash later summed up the experience as follows. Bob Dylan is definitely one of the icons of rock and roll, and he was one of the people my parents used to listen to. But working on the album was just such a bad experience. The 2 minutes this track lasts are musically tolerable, but lyrically, Wiggle Wiggle ranks among the absolute worst songs Dylan ever wrote, recorded, and released. Critic Patrick Humphreys, author of The Complete Guide to the Music of Bob Dylan, was already deeply unimpressed with Under the Red Sky, but he saved his most brutal attack for its opening track. Then there's Wiggle Wiggle, worse than anything Dylan has ever recorded? Maybe not that bad, but certainly up there, jostling for position in that particular part of hell where the jukebox plays nothing but Joey from Desire and Had a Dream About You, Baby from Down in the Groove. Wiggle Wiggle was the one critics immediately pounced on, particularly the line Wiggle 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 like a bowl of soup, which was taken as definitive proof that Dylan had finally, permanently, irrevocably lost it. It was hard to disagree. Reconciling such a line with the man who wrote Desolation Row is no easy task. Of course, you can't get Hamlet or Like a Rolling Stone every time, but Wiggle Wiggle? After hearing the opening track, it's hard not to agree with Humphreys. Unfortunately, he's absolutely right. Thankfully, Dylan does manage to recover slightly with the title track. The slide guitar by ex-Beatle and fellow Wilbury George Harrison is tasteful and restrained, while the organ, played by Al Cooper, just as on the aforementioned Like a Rolling Stone, is pleasant enough, though it lacks even a trace of the magic that defined that iconic 60s performance. Dylan's own accordion playing also deserves a mention, but while the lyrics here are certainly less disastrous than those of its predecessor, they hardly qualify as a lyrical high point within Dylan's vast catalog. The fact that the song goes down fairly easily says more about how the album has started than about the inherent strength of the track itself. That said, Dylan biographer Clinton Halen has described Under the Red Sky as an important song, noting that it has remained a recurring part of Dylan's live repertoire. According to Dylan's official website, the song has been performed live 208 times, and somewhat surprisingly, it even appeared regularly on set lists as recently as 2025. As a Dylan concert goer in recent years, you already have to work quite hard to detect flashes of quality and magic in the live performances. And I doubt many people, even the most devoted fans, are truly clamoring for a live rendition of this particular song. That said, YouTube is full of audience recordings that give a fairly accurate impression of how the song is performed today. And I'll admit it, this version actually isn't half bad. I've heard Dylan do far more senseless damage to much greater classics than he does here.
There was a little boy with a little girl. They lived in an alley under the red sky. Was a little boy, a little girl lived in an alley under the red sky.
The tempo is cranked up for a nicely rocking blues shuffle called Unbelievable. It's a pleasant tune, but truly nothing to write home about. Between 1992 and 2004, Dylan could only bring himself to perform it live 29 times, which tells you just about everything you need to know. Sure, it all sounds perfectly serviceable. The harmonica wails, the guitar gets to stretch out a bit, but beyond that, there's very little of note to report. We're only 3 songs in, and the album is already parading a stubborn streak of mediocrity. Now that is unbelievable. especially when you consider that this is a Bob Dylan album featuring such an impressive roster of high-profile guest musicians. Thankfully, Born in Time follows, an outtake from the sublime Oh Mercy, and at last, the first genuinely good song on this 27th album by Zimmy. With piano by Bruce Hornsby and backing vocals from David Crosby, Born in Time allows a bit of the Oh Mercy magic to shine through once again. Because Dylan has never been a technically great singer, he can carry strong material just fine, no matter how battered his vocal cords may sound. But when the songwriting itself is weak, that vocal limitation starts working against him, making the songs even harder to sit through. Fortunately, Born in Time offers enough lyrical and melodic substance to prevent the A-side from completely derailing and collapsing into a swamp of mediocrity and outright bad songs. Eric Clapton later recorded this track for his equally poorly received album Pilgrim. And while I can live quite comfortably with that version as well, that Clapton album would also make for an excellent candidate for this very series. Because was it really that bad? The first half of the album closes with TV Talkin' Song. And much like Unbelievable, it's not necessarily a disastrously bad song. It's just not one that really sticks. As on Born in Time, Bruce Hornsby's piano work is tasteful and effective. But beyond that, this song, which deals with the dangers of television's influence, feels like a missed opportunity. Those who dig into the lyrics will hear Dylan telling a story set at Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park, where a man tries to warn passersby about the corrosive effects television has on everyday life. As the speech grows increasingly extreme, tensions rise and a riot eventually breaks out among the crowd. That very chaos is then captured by a TV crew and broadcast later that same day on the evening news. The irony, of course, is obvious. A passionate warning about the dangers of television ultimately produces television images. It's an original, bizarre, and possibly even true story, wrapped in a solid piece of talking blues. Unfortunately, due to the rather pedestrian musical backing and Dylan's vocal delivery, the idea never fully comes to life. Instead, TV, Talkin' Song, ends up sounding like just another relentlessly chugging blues number on the first side of Red Sky. Side B keeps digging deeper into the blues with 10,000 Men. Blues Brothers. Jimmy and Stevie Ray Vaughan both play on the track and clearly give it their all, but even the combined talent of these two blues giants can't rescue the song from mediocrity. What is left is yet another middling exercise. One more piece of musical filler on an album that has, so far, been wildly inconsistent at best and outright weak at worst. 10,000 Men was performed live exactly once on November the 12th, 2000. So technically speaking, the people in attendance at Keeney Auditorium in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, witnessed a historic moment. Unfortunately, that moment took the form of a rather underwhelming blues song, and without the Vaughan brothers, since Stevie Ray had, sadly, long since passed away by then. It's fair to say that particular concert won't be making the history books anytime soon. A beautifully delicate guitar intro and Elton John's piano briefly raise hopes that 2x2 might have something special in store. Hopes that are quickly dashed the moment Dylan's trademark rasp starts delivering the lyrics. Even David Crosby's backing vocals can't rescue the song musically. Here, Bob decides to hang his words on a counting timetable, using basic arithmetic as a framework to get his message across. On paper, that might sound like a playful idea. In practice, it misses the mark completely. At times, you can't help but wonder, what on earth am I listening to? It honestly starts to feel like an episode of Sesame Street. Dylan fires questions at the listener while casually demonstrating that he can count and multiply at least up to 10. Unfortunately, the deeper meaning and intended second layer never quite land, making this yet another missed opportunity. Much like TV Talkin' Song. Lyrically, Dylan touches on weighty themes: birth and death, guilt and responsibility, social order, and moral law. Heavy subjects, essential aspects of human existence, placed in stark contrast to the cold, static certainty of mathematical rules. The central idea of 2x2 is actually quite clear. Just as mathematical laws are fixed, so too are moral laws. Dylan uses arithmetic as a metaphor for moral causality. Actions have consequences, guilt remains guilt, truth remains truth. Relativism won't get you off the hook. Just as 2x2 equals 4 is non-negotiable, So are concepts like good and evil, responsibility, and human choice. This aligns neatly with Dylan's broader work from this period, in which he increasingly emphasized biblical thinking and moral absolutes. Under the Red Sky and songs like Two Times Two were often dismissed as childish, lightweight, or even sloppily written. But several tracks, including this one, were deliberately constructed as fables, using simple language to communicate fundamental truths, much like Bible stories, fairy tales, or parables. Not linguistically complex, but absolutely firm in their convictions. By 1990, Dylan had moved beyond his explicit born-again Christian phase, yet his worldview remained deeply moralistic, with a strong emphasis on order, law, and consequence. Two Times Two fits squarely into that framework, a song about inevitability, about a world in which certain things are fixed, whether you like it or not. The implicit message is simple. You can deny the rules, but they'll still apply. So why does the song sound so irritating or weak? Because the form is deliberately naive, the lyrics lack poetic imagery, and Dylan isn't charming or enigmatic here. He's instructing. For listeners who expect Dylan the cryptic poet, surrealist, or ironic commentator, Two Times Two feels like a downgrade. And that's the real shame. A song with a genuinely important message ultimately fails to translate musically, and on a casual listen can easily be dismissed as just another weak moment on an already uneven Red Sky album. The Lord is Never Far Away on God Knows, a clear indication that Dylan's newly born-again Christian phase had not yet been fully left behind in 1990. He obviously didn't fall out of faith overnight. And because Dylan is, after all, well, Dylan, we'll probably never know exactly why he moved from an overtly Christian worldview back toward a far less religious tone in his music by the late 1980s. In terms of atmosphere, God Knows comes closest to sounding like a Randy Newman song, albeit without the level of quality Newman's material usually delivers. Stevie Ray Vaughan fares better here than on the other tracks he appears on. His guitar work is more focused and effective, and as a result, this song almost deserves a cautious passing grade. The opening seconds of Handy Dandy immediately bring to mind the iconic intro of Like a Rolling Stone. Same organ, same Al Cooper behind the keys. Anyone playing an intro quiz and instinctively shouting out the answer after those first few seconds is in for a rude awakening, because this is most definitely not like a Rolling Stone. And that contrast only makes the weakness of the lyrics painfully obvious. Handy Dandy, just like Sugar and Candy, is, let's be honest, a far cry from Once Upon a Time You Dressed So Fine. As we approach the end of Red Sky, a clear pattern emerges. Musically, most of these songs are perfectly listenable. The real problem lies in the lyrics. Often nonsensical, lightweight lines that Dylan pours out in his frail, disengaged delivery. The urgency in his vocals is almost entirely absent, which goes a long way toward explaining why this album fails to truly connect or move most listeners. Handy Dandy ends up sounding like a third-rate, like a Rolling Stone, and that is quite simply beneath Dylan's stature. Across much of the album, you get the distinct impression that Bob himself had little interest in writing these songs, or at the very least, didn't attach much value to them, which makes it all the more striking that, according to several sources, Dylan was deeply affected by the poor sales and negative reception of Under the Red Sky. For most of the record, he sounds like he couldn't care less about what he's doing. And yet, when the verdict came in, it clearly wasn't something he could just shrug off. Musically, Under the Red Sky closes on a relatively strong note with Cats in the Well. It's a Cajun-flavored track that sounds like something Ry Cooder or Little Feat might have tossed off on a particularly uninspired afternoon. The kind of song you'd expect to find buried deep on an outtakes compilation like the Bootleg series, rather than proudly closing a Bob Dylan album. To be fair, the musicianship is tasteful and professional, but once again, Zimmy manages to torpedo the entire thing with his downright boneheaded lyrics. In that sense, Cats in the Well is a perfectly fitting finale for Red Sky, occasionally competent, sometimes almost convincing, but never able, for more than a fleeting moment, to rise above persistent mediocrity. At just 35 minutes, Under the Red Sky isn't a long listen, but it is an uncomfortable one. This is not a soft, inviting armchair you sink into and let the music carry you away. It feels more like a half-baked record by someone who hurriedly threw together a handful of songs without much focus, urgency, or inspiration. Interestingly enough, Dylan himself admitted as much in 2006. He was simply too busy with the traveling Wilburys. Too many different people were involved in the project, and at that point he had grown deeply disillusioned with the recording industry. Critic Patrick Humphreys was particularly outspoken, stating bluntly that the album was everything Oh Mercy wasn't: sloppily written songs, lazily performed, and unimaginatively produced. The first bridge of 2 by 2, with the line, "How much poison did they inhale?" briefly recalls the menace that pervaded Oh Mercy, but otherwise, where there had once been certainty and confidence, here there is confusion and indecision. Across its 35 minutes and 10 tracks, only 4 tracks managed to scrape a 6 or higher in my rating. And the only genuine standouts are the title track and Born in Time. Considering that the latter is a leftover from the Oh Mercy sessions, that effectively reduces the number of real highlights on this album to 1. One song rises above mediocrity and manages to convince musically and melodically. And even then, it takes the presence of a former Beatle on guitar to get there. 10,000 Men and God Knows scrape just above a passing grade, but they come nowhere near rescuing the album as a whole. As mentioned earlier, Don Wa's production is slick, too slick, and far too polished for an artist of Dylan's stature. It painfully recalls the sterile, clinical sound that plagued much of his 80s output. Coming off the back of Oh Mercy, Under the Red Sky feels like a bitter disappointment. For a brief moment, it seemed the holy fire had returned, only to be extinguished almost immediately. Very little of Oh Mercy's magic can be found on Red Sky. Anyone diving into the bootleg series, Volume 8 with the accompanying liner notes in hand, will quickly realize just how much of the truly strong material originated from Dylan's collaboration with Daniel Lanois during the Oh Mercy sessions. This album could easily have been a double record, or perhaps even better, a separate follow-up that would have rendered Under the Red Sky completely unnecessary. Oh, if only. Instead, we got a long list of famous, top-tier musicians who, collectively, still failed to turn Red Sky into an album that could even remotely compete with Oh Mercy. Is Under the Red Sky the worst album in Bob Dylan's catalog? Despite everything, I'd still answer that question with a cautious no. But if it isn't his worst, it certainly ranks very, very low. And yet, after repeated listens, one question can finally be answered with confidence. Is it really that bad? Yes. Sadly, even giants stumble from time to time. It would take 2 acoustic folk albums and an MTV Unplugged session before Dylan finally rose from the ashes in 1997, once again joining forces with Daniel Lanois. Time Out of Mind decisively closed the chapter on an era of underwhelming studio albums, even if Bob would later surprise us with a Christmas record and 3 albums of American standards. Columbia Records' most successful recording artist, Mr. Bob Dylan, still an elusive, contradictory figure. And that precisely is why the man from Minnesota continues to fascinate us. And that brings us to the very first episode of the new year. That was Bob Dylan. That was Under the Red Sky. What do you think of this album? Do you really consider it as bad as I do? Or do you actually think it's a perfectly fine record? Let me know in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your take. You can also vote in the poll in the Community tab. That way, we can keep things interactive and eventually see what the general consensus is among viewers of this channel. The couple of Red Sky tracks that I can personally tolerate can be found in the Spotify playlist, where you can also listen back to all the music featured in the series. And don't forget to check out the channel's social media pages on Facebook and Instagram for updates, because I will follow you if you follow me. All the links are down below. And of course, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Tell a friend about the channel. Why not? It's very much appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.